Hello and welcome to the omnibus edition of this week's Spectator TV. Now, before we get going, talk about this week's issue, I'm here to talk about the Spectator shop that's just been opened. We've now got everything on there, jigsaws, merchandise, and the caps, which are selling very well, as you can evidently see. In this week's magazine, Katie Balls and Michael Simmons are asking, where is Britain's growth? 1,500 words talking about the problems facing the UK economy. Now, onto the show. First up, do we need to decolonise Shakespeare? Katharine Birbalsingh says no. She discusses with John Connolly.
Katharine, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. What did you make when you first saw that the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust is attempting to decolonise its collection?
I thought they'd never get here, but they have eventually. I always thought that Shakespeare was untouchable, but I always used to think, I bet he's not. And of course, here we go again, which is, of course, what most of the British public think, when every time it's just not again, because it's ridiculous. Shakespeare is yet again another dead white man, and we are attacking them all of the time, and we are destroying our culture. We're lucky enough to have inherited this extraordinary literary, artistic, historical culture, which newer countries like Australia or Canada and so on would kill for. And yet we just want to throw it out the window.
And why do you think that is? What do you think is the motivation behind things like this?
Yeah, well, that's what's so fascinating, which is obviously to do with race. That was really brought to the forefront in 2020 with Black Lives Matter and George Floyd. And the guilt that white people feel. And, I want to put a plea out there to all white people. Please let go of the guilt. I'm begging you all, please let go of the guilt. Because this guilt is going to destroy the West. It's going to destroy our schools. And we don't understand the damage that it's doing. And let me explain what I mean. So, a white person, and I'm not blaming white people, I get it, they're made to feel guilty by the media that is around this, by the history that exists, and they feel somehow that the guilt is inherited, that because their ancestors did X, Y, and Z, that means they did those things, and that isn't true. They haven't. And what we then become, we're in an age of identity politics where everything becomes performative. So you're not allowed to just not be a racist. Once upon a time, when I was growing up, you wanted to not be a racist. Nowadays, not being a racist isn't good enough. You have to be an anti-racist. So Ibram X. Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, all those people in America have pushed this idea that if you're not a racist, you are actually a racist, that you've got to be an anti-racist. Now, being an anti-racist, what that means is to be performative in the way that you demonstrate that you are not a racist. So it means putting a black box up on Instagram. It means telling everybody that you're doing anti-bias training. It's all about how you show that you are not a racist, as opposed to trying to be a decent person. Because, look, we're all flawed. We're human beings. We show elements of unkindness. We show elements of lack of generosity. We show elements of meanness sometimes, selfishness, and so on. And sometimes we show elements of racism. And in the early 21st century, 2003, 4, 5, and so on, there was a play called Avenue Q. It was a musical theater thing. And they had a great song. You can Google it, called Everyone's a Little Bit Racist. And it was this great Muppet show. And in those days, we can make fun of this sort of thing. Everyone's a little bit racist, but we're not committing hate crimes. That's what's in the piece. It's really fun. Nowadays, nobody would dare do that because we're not allowed to admit that everybody's a little bit racist, and it's not a big deal. It's okay. Now, that doesn't mean that serious racism isn't a big deal. It is. But sometimes when you make a little assumption about something, or it's something to check, it's something to think, oh, am I being a little bit racist? But it's not something to be thinking, oh my goodness, how can I perform on Facebook and on Instagram by telling everybody, look how I'm not a racist? Or by decolonizing Shakespeare's birthplace, because I think this is all about the performance. It's all about white people feeling guilty and saying, I need to tell everybody that I'm not part of that group of racists over there. I'm different. Therefore, I believe in decolonizing Shakespeare's birthplace. Therefore, I believe in decolonizing schools, libraries, in making sure that we remove the canon that we used to have in the literature that we would teach our children, that we don't teach British history anymore, that we move to teaching a very different sort of history because we are so guilty. And this, I think, is doing great harm to the nation. It harms both white people and ethnic minorities, and it definitely harms race relations, because it means that whenever anything is talked about when it comes to race, and when there are really serious racial issues happening in the country, nobody takes it seriously because everybody just thinks, oh my goodness, they roll their eyes, not again.
I wanted to take you up, Katharine, on that point about sort of harming ethnic minorities as well. So one of the ways the Birthplace Trust justifies this move is saying it's all about getting sort of underrepresented communities into the museum and enjoying Shakespeare. But the sort of implication of that is that the only way ethnic minorities can enjoy Shakespeare is through the sort of decolonisation frame. I mean, your schools, as we know, probably quite ethnically diverse. Is that something you found yourself, that the only way to get diverse students involved in Shakespeare is through decolonisation?
It is so patronizing. So this is the other thing, that all these they are well-meaning white people, okay? So I understand they mean well, right? But it is hugely patronizing to say to a black boy, obviously, you can't possibly access Shakespeare in the way that a white child can. We need to do it differently for you because of the color of your skin. Listen, I have been teaching children of all colors for over 25 years. We do 4 Shakespeare plays at our school. We do them in depth. The kids understand Shakespearean language. Our children are from a variety of backgrounds. You know, every possible, it's like United Nations. Every, you know, their parents and their grandparents and so on are from all over the place.
Mm.
And we have every possible religion. It's amazing. Okay. Now, every single one of them can access Shakespeare. They can access Shakespeare when the teacher is really passionate about it, when the teacher is able to break down their explanations and build up the scaffolding that they need and get them to understand it. And once the children understand it, they can then read it and enjoy it. And they enjoy it because Shakespeare is universal.
Mm.
Shakespeare speaks to all of us because he talks about the human condition, what it is to feel jealousy and anger and experience death and birth and so on. All of these ideas that Shakespeare encompasses, which he has been doing for over 400 years. Like, the key thing about Shakespeare is that he has been influencing literature for over 400 years. Maya Angelou, when she first read Shakespeare, thought to herself, surely Shakespeare must have been a black woman because he understands my plight. That is what she thought. And she thought that because Shakespeare speaks to us all. And the main thing that people don't understand about dead white men, they go, dead white men, oh my goodness, we've got to get rid of them. And my thing about dead white men is, the most important thing about them is not the fact that they are men and not the fact that they are white, but the fact that they are dead. Right? That is why we're interested in that. They are dead. I don't care if they're men. I don't care if they're white. Shakespeare has been dead for 400 years. He is an extraordinary author and he has been influencing literature for 400 years. Therefore, the Maya Angelous of this world would not exist without him. Now, that doesn't mean you can't read Maya Angelou, but it does mean that when you're a 12-year-old, you need to begin somewhere.
Mm.
And having a thorough understanding of Shakespeare gives you the foundations that are required to be able to move beyond that. So obviously at university, clearly they need to be doing a whole variety of literature, and even at A level, you know, fine. But the canon needs to be protected. And one of the things I worry about with Bridget Phillipson in Post and the very far left leanings that she has with regard to the changes that she is making to the bill that she's pushing through Parliament quietly right now, is that they are going to decolonize our curriculum, not just ours, everybody across the nation. They are going to reduce the standards of what is required, both by decolonizing and by just reducing standards. My prediction is that the Progress 8 measure that is currently being used will be changed. It will be altered to make sure that academic subjects that are difficult are not promoted above other subjects, which has been the case so far. And I suspect that the decolonization, look, if you want to decolonize and bring in Chinua Achebe, Nigerian author who's very hard to read, fine. But if you bring in Benjamin Zephaniah instead, you are reducing the standards that the children have to reach. The fact is that, one, there is the standards argument, then there is the argument around, but this is British. Shakespeare should be untouchable. And this is now the decolonization process that has been happening across the country for so long now. It's been going for so long. They are now even touching Shakespeare. What does it even mean to decolonize his birthplace? It's completely ridiculous. You know, the fact is, Shakespeare is extraordinary. We should leave him alone. We should teach it to all children of all colors. We should do it in the same way, whether they are brown, black, or white. Kids are kids. This idea that white kids are different from black kids, it's not true. All children can access Shakespeare. It does not matter what color they are. And I don't know why in 2025 I'm having to explain this, but unfortunately, identity politics have moved us into a post-age now of racism, where actually anti-racism is racism. Not being racist is not being racist. Being anti-racist turns you into a performing seal, which means you're then thinking about race all the time. When in fact, what you want to do is not be thinking about race all the time and thinking of children as just children, whatever color or religion they are.
It's so fascinating to hear that the Maya Angelou quotes that you mentioned, and to sort of contrast it what the Trust has been saying, which is supposedly the custodian of Shakespeare. So this decolonization process follows a research project from 2022, which kind of argued that the idea of Shakespeare's universal genius benefits the ideology of white European supremacy.
Look, the thing is that my understanding of race is actually quite nuanced and interesting. I am not saying that there's no such thing as racism. And I'm not even saying that the only types of racism are people who put excrement through your door. I actually think that racism is quite complex and demonstrates itself in various ways. I would actually argue that the people who are so worried about all of this race stuff are partly doing that because they have a problem with race, is what I'd say. So when they're saying white supremacy, it's now become synonymous with Western supremacy. So what we mean by that is anything Western means if you want to promote something Western, you're promoting white supremacy. If you want to promote British history over some African history, that's white supremacy. If you want to promote Shakespeare over a black author, that's white supremacy. When actually, maybe it's just because we value the culture and the history of the West, and we want to promote that with our children. And what that then reveals, and this is what I mean about race being complex, what that then reveals is the people who are making these decisions genuinely don't believe that black and brown people can be British and can be a real part of the West. I feel I am just as Western as you. I am just as British as you. And because I believe that it is my children's birthright here to be able to be taught Shakespeare in the way that any white child would. And this idea that ethnic minorities cannot access this unless it's somehow been painted with the brush of decolonization, as if somehow we're going to get poisoned by Shakespeare if it's not done. There's nothing different. You and I are the same. As Shylock talked about, does a Jew not bleed? Does a Jew not feel? Does a Jew not? Yes, we are all the same. You prick us and we bleed. That is just, look, for goodness sakes, Shakespeare understood that. We need to learn from Shakespeare. We are the ones with a problem with race, not Shakespeare. And honestly, it outrages me because I know that right now, Bridget Phillipson Bill, she's changing the curriculum. Right now, there is a curriculum body trying to figure out how they should change the curriculum. I know that there is only one ethnic minority in that group. And that ethnic minority guy is the guy who's fighting for the canon. He's the one fighting for Shakespeare. And all the white people on that group are saying, no, we need to decolonize. What we all need to realize is that it is guilty whites who are pushing this agenda, okay? And too often, I found this with Hamid Patel's appointment to the chair of Ofsted. This, by the way, you've never known who another chair of Ofsted has been. The reason why is because it's an irrelevant post. Nobody cares. What matters is the chief of inspector. He's the guy who runs Ofsted. Amanda Spielman. Every chief inspector you have heard of before. And the reason you've heard of them and you haven't heard of the chair is that it's irrelevant. It's a 2-day post per week, and it's for 5 months. He's in an interim post, totally insignificant. And yet people see his face come up and they go, oh my goodness, this is a real problem.
Katharine, we should probably give a little bit of background here, which is that Sir Hamid Patel, he's the head of a big academy chain in the UK, which includes lots of Islamic schools, but also some non-Islamic schools. And he's been appointed the temporary chair of Ofsted. Is that right?
Yes. And the chair of Ofsted.
And there has been some backlash because the way he presents himself in particular suggests he's a pretty observant Muslim.
Well, you say that. That's one photo. When I met him, he was just in Western clothes.
Fair enough.
The fact is, they throw around that photo and everybody goes mad. The fact is, he's just a brown guy like me. And he's a guy who's done an amazing job with schools. And they've put him in there for a few months. It's no big deal. But everybody goes mad. And I kind of get it. I get why they go mad. Because they're going mad for the same reason that they're going mad over decolonization of Shakespeare's birthplace. They're looking at that and going, oh my goodness, not again. And I get that. I do get that. But the fact is that he's an excellent practitioner who's in there for a little while. The people we need to be worried about are on that curriculum body. The people we need to worry about are the ones like Bridget Phillipson who feel guilty about their whiteness, and they are then going to decolonize our curriculum. So then when your children are coming home and they're not being taught Shakespeare, it has nothing to do with Hamid Patel or me or the person who's arguing on that group who's another ethnic minority. We are the ones arguing for the canon. We are the ones that the whites will not listen to because the whites are so desperate to perform in such a way to demonstrate that they're not racist. We don't have that feeling. We're not thinking we have to demonstrate how we're not racist. In fact, we're actually arguing for British culture, Western history, for all the things that you know and love at the Spectator. You know, unfortunately, not everybody thinks like this. We need to deal with the source, which is the white guilt. Now, look, I'm not saying there are black people out there and brown people out there pushing a different narrative, like Ibram X. Kendi and those like him. So I get that, but we need to ignore those people. We need to fight for what is ours, and what is ours is Britain. Britain belongs to you just as it belongs to my kids. Shakespeare belongs to you just as he belongs to my kids. And the only way that we can all come together in the multicultural country that we've got and live in harmony together is if we share our history and share our artists and our writers as if they belong to all of us, and to stop seeing white supremacy everywhere, because anytime any one of us wants to promote the West, you then get accused of white supremacy. It isn't white supremacy. It's simply Western supremacy, which we live in the West. Obviously, we think the West is great. It would be weird if we didn't.
Next, Michael Gove, myself and Amanda Spielman all discussed Bridget Phillipson's education reforms. Amanda is the former head of Ofsted. Michael, first of all, the Children's Welfare Bill, or Education Bill, returns to Parliament this week. Tell us where we stand at the beginning of this, and Labour doesn't seem to be looking like they're going to make many concessions, do they?
No. So the bill is a bill of two halves, as it were. It's both a schools bill and a well-being bill. The second half, the well-being measures, are broadly uncontentious. Some of them deal with children who are taken out of school and homeschooled and making sure that there are appropriate safeguards in place. And there are some other measures which are broadly welcomed. But the schools element is deeply contentious. And that's because the government wants to significantly alter the landscape, particularly with respect to academies and particularly with respect to how underperforming schools are tackled. And there are a range of provisions which the opposition and critics, including myself, have taken exception to, one of which restricts the growth of good schools, another of which leaves it uncertain what will happen to underperforming schools. Will they be taken into the hands of academy trusts, and will the people who have real expertise in turning around underperforming schools continue to have that opportunity? And also there are restrictions on everything from the number of items of branded uniform that a school can require of its students, through to ultimately requiring all academy schools to follow the national curriculum. The last element of that is particularly concerning because we don't know what is going to happen to the national curriculum. A review of the national curriculum has been ordered by Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary. It's being led by an academic, Becky Francis. There are some indications that some of the changes that have been made in order to introduce a greater degree of rigour, particularly in core academic subjects, may be dispensed with. All of these changes together are a step away from the broad consensus of where education policy should be ever since Tony Blair was Prime Minister, actually preceding that. And that has caused disquiet, particularly because the government has shown very little interest in listening to its critics. Its approach has been to rubbish them rather than to engage with them so far.
Amanda, I mean, you experienced this over the weekend when you wrote an excellent piece of The Telegraph talking about some of your concerns. What do you think is motivating Labour behind this bill? And have you been surprised, perhaps, at some of the briefing against you?
I haven't been entirely surprised, but I felt it was really important to say that the accumulation of changes through the bill and elsewhere do seem to add up, firstly, to a significant shift towards policy to please unions. And unions, of course, have an agenda about the adults in the school, first and foremost, their members. And I do worry about rebalancing the system in favour of the adults over the children. And the second point I think that can be made is a move away from evidence-based policy. It's striking that all of these changes and restrictions on academies, there's been no sort of serious systematic evaluation of which bits of giving schools and academy trusts autonomy are working well and which bits might need tweaking. Similarly, we haven't yet seen any sort of real systematic evaluation of how the curriculum freedom that academies have has been used, where it's been used well, where it's been used less well. I would have expected that to come before changes as sweeping as this.
And Michael, I suppose I mean, what do you think are the elements of the academies that maybe do need requiring fixing? I mean, for instance, I think it was striking that over the weekend there was, some of the Labour-friendly papers have been talking about some of the high pay paid to head teachers. I mean, do you think that's an area where there's legitimate cause for concern, perhaps, or do you think that really that only a few issues have been seized upon and blown up into this piece of legislation that isn't really required?
I fear it's more the latter. I think Amanda's right. There's been no real theory of change here. So there's been no case that's been made by the government, whether in speeches or in a white or green paper, which analyses what's right and what's wrong in our education system. I think that there are problems that do need fixing in our education system. They relate specifically, of course, to the treatment of children with special educational needs, the fact that there are some parts of our country where progress has been painfully slow in school improvement, and also there are understandable concerns about recruitment within the profession, relating broadly to other challenges in the labour market, but still real issues here. But there's been no systematic attempt by the government to explain what it considers to be the real weaknesses and why this legislation is the answer. And I think the question of the chief executives of multi-academy trusts or top head teachers being paid significant sums is a bit of a red herring, because if you have someone like Sir Dan Moynihan, who is the chief executive of the Harris Academy Trust, one of the best performing school chains in the country, then in my view, he almost can't be paid too much, because he's transforming the lives of thousands, tens of thousands of children. And payment for success is a good thing in the public or the private sector. What really should be the case is not a focus on remuneration for a few individuals. It's what changes help the mass of students to do better. And again, every minister, myself included, will have some degree of vanity as they look back at the things that they enacted. And it's always necessary to have a new government or a new administration look with clear eyes at the legacy that it inherited. But if you're going to make changes on this scale, then I think that you need to have an overall justification That's not there. And some of the statistics that the government uses to make its case, and they're used fitfully and sporadically, relate to the fact that there are a number of academies that are still requires improvement or inadequate, according to Ofsted judgments. There are two things about that. The first thing is that many of these schools were local authority-maintained schools that have become academies. So they're the schools which are at the beginning of their journey of transformation and improvement. The second thing is that the government themselves said that one word, Ofsted judgments, did not do justice to the complexity of the performance of any particular school. I do disagree with that. But more than that, they're using these judgments to castigate the last government for there being 600 or so schools that have stayed stuck at the requires improvement level. So they're attacking the last government for failing schools by a metric that they themselves say doesn't do justice to what's really happening in our school system. It's that incoherence which is the most frustrating thing.
And Amanda, I mean, if this bill passes, and it looks like, given the mood we've talked about of the Labour ministers and their advisors, and given the majority in Parliament, what do you think is likely to happen to schools over the next course of this Parliament?
Well, as I said in my Telegraph piece, if we look abroad, we can see other countries where some excellent reforms have been reversed when a government of a different flavour comes in. And the consequences are pretty predictable. If you shift the system towards an agenda that's designed to please unions will always like greater centralisation, for example. They have the most clout in a system that is most directly controlled by government at the centre. There's actually another interesting angle that I haven't seen anybody pick up on, which is that intervention is going to get, in weak schools, is going to get increasingly politicised, because whether or not it's the right thing to do to hook it directly onto Ofsted overall inspection judgments, now it's completely uncertain. Some findings and some data will land on the desk of a civil servant somewhere in DfE, and without speaking to the school directly, without speaking to the inspector, they will have to make a decision with an eye to the minister. There'll be ministerial civil servants and what might please the minister. And of course, there'll be lots and lots of lobbying to avert interventions and consequences that people don't want. So I think we could see the whole system get much more bogged down in challenges to DfE decisions as well as to inspection. We could see just a real morass emerge.
And I think Amanda's absolutely spot on, and this point was made right at the beginning of the introduction of this legislation by the Labour MP Siobhan McDonagh. Siobhan pointed out that at the moment, if a school falls below a certain threshold, then its transformation into an academy is automatic. And there have been cases in the past where when that situation was not in place, placing a local authority school into an academy trust led to protests, judicial review, uncertainty for the children. Whereas the certainty of going into a high-performing academy trust means that the process of transformation can be accelerated and the schools can benefit and the students critically can benefit more quickly. So this legislation, if enacted as it is, will introduce uncertainty where there's certainty, and it will slow or potentially even put into reverse the path of improvement. So why is the government doing this? Well, again, as Amanda points out, this change was a key demand of the trades unions because from their point of view, they want to stymie this process of academisation because they want centralised control over pay and conditions, and they want the academy movement stopped in its tracks. And it is striking that a Labour government is not listening to Blairites like Siobhan McDonagh, but instead is listening to the trade union movement. What's even more concerning is that Daniel Kebede, who's the head of the leading teachers' union, the NEU, is an avowed Trotskyite. His words, not mine. And the person who's about to become, if reports to believe, the head of the second largest teaching union, the NASUWT, is someone called Matt Rack, who's not a teacher. He's a former firefighter, a former head of the FBU, who in the 1980s was a member of Militant Tendency alongside Derek Hatton. Now, I'm sure he's a lovely chap, but the one thing that worries me is that if you have a Labour government listening to trade unions headed by people who have been or are avowed Trotskyites, and one of them is someone who's never even taught in a school, then what you have is Keir Starmer's government being driven by ideology, not by evidence on education, and that runs counter to what he's seeking to do in almost every other area of policy.
And that principle of grounding policy in evidence, and there've been some really good evolutions. I picked up on the teacher training standards and the early career framework as examples of good evidence-based policy, where putting them under review has just created a great uncertainty about what's going to happen in future. I think this principle of drawing on the body of evidence is a really important one.
Has Putin played Trump? Freddie Gray discusses now with Jacob Heilbrunn.
And Jacob, you have written a piece for The Spectator, the headline of which is Putin agrees to the bare minimum to placate Trump. Do you think that it really was the bare minimum? Could Putin have been even more obstinate in his concessions?
Well, first of all, Freddie, I should like to welcome you to our shores here. I'm glad to see that you made it through customs and immigration unscathed.
I should say, yeah, I'm in New York. I'm enjoying the golden age.
It's certainly begun with a bang. The Putin-Trump colloquy was much anticipated here, but I don't think it delivered what Trump wanted. If you watch the interview that he did on Fox News last night with Laura Ingraham, he was dodging a little bit because basically Putin did not agree to the ceasefire that Trump had said would be easy to accomplish. Instead, he indicated that he would cease missile attacks on infrastructure and energy. But of course, within an hour or a couple hours of speaking with Trump, the Russians then launched another fusillade of attacks that included hospitals and energy infrastructure in Ukraine. So I think Trump is discovering, both in the Middle East and in Ukraine, that his promises of peace in our time are becoming difficult to fulfill.
Well, yes, and it's interesting you mentioned the Middle East, because it seems to me that Putin and Trump didn't just talk about Ukraine. They clearly talked about Iran too. Both the White House and the Kremlin have confirmed that they agreed that Iran should never get nuclear weapons. And I believe they talked about intensifying pressure on Tehran, which is quite significant given Putin's friendship with Iran over the years. Do you think, to a certain extent, Trump has accepted that Putin really does have all the leverage when it comes to Ukraine at the moment? He appears to be winning the war. Certainly without massive American support, Ukraine is likely to crumble. And so therefore he is trying to extract concessions in the Middle East for a sort of bigger deal, a bigger peace bargain in the Holy Land, and a sort of perhaps a more significant one for more countries.
Well, there's an interesting piece on Trump today. As you may know, he has appointed himself the head of the Kennedy Center here, the cultural arts institution in Washington, D.C. And in a meeting with his handpicked board a day or so ago, he reminisced about why Cats was his favorite musical by Andrew Lloyd Webber from the 1980s. Trump lives mentally, culturally, and politically in the 1980s. That was the era in which Ronald Reagan struck sweeping accords with Mikhail Gorbachev, and we saw the dissolution ultimately of the Soviet Union. I think Trump, who fancies himself winning a Nobel Peace Prize, would like to reach a grand bargain, as it were, with Putin. That is, Ukraine is just a stepping stone. He would like a sweeping arms control deals with Russia. He would like economic deals, American investment in Russia, particularly for its resources. And ultimately, the idea is that he can pull what's being called a reverse Kissinger, which is to detach Russia from the Chinese orbit. Now, how practical any of this is another question. But as always, President Trump thinks big.
Well, 7 years ago, almost exactly, I think it was actually 7 years ago today, Trump decided that he wanted to have a call with Putin to congratulate him on his re-election. And then the following day, they had the call, March 20th. And Trump was under strict instructions to not congratulate. His national security advisors told him not to congratulate Putin on his re-election. But of course, Trump completely ignored that and congratulated Putin on his re-election and invited him to Washington, which went down very badly in national security circles, both in London and in America, because Putin had just, apparently, according to British intelligence, the Kremlin had ordered the Salisbury Novichok attack. But what struck me reading about that call 7 years ago was how different things are now. And that no national security advisor, I can't imagine Mike Waltz writing any such bossy note to Donald Trump. I can't imagine him saying, do not do this. So to some extent, Trump has become a more Putin-esque figure. He is not beholden to the establishments in the way that he was.
Actually, I think Trump may have more maneuvering room than Putin does, because there are various factions in the Kremlin and in Russian society that Putin has to deal with. Whereas here we have a Republican Party that has prostrated itself before Trump. And the only real barrier to Trump's authoritarian ambitions is the judiciary, which he is targeting as well. So, and Trump does seem to be displaying Putin-esque tendencies, the idea of annexing Canada, Greenland, the Panama Canal. He is definitely flexing his muscles and has a vision that was absent in the first term. Now, part of it is that he knows that he has to come up with something new almost every day to keep the attention focused on himself and to keep his base happy. So far, Trump has done a brilliant job of that.
And do you think the call with Putin, from what you're saying, you don't think Trump got what he wanted? Do you think there will be animosity there now? We are going to see these talks are resuming in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. And we will see, I think Rubio and Waltz will be over there talking to the Russians. Do you think we might see a breakdown in the seemingly friendly approach of Russia and America in light of that phone call? Or do you think the American side are just going to press on, accepting that Russia isn't giving them much?
Well, right now, I think Trump is doing everything in his power to accommodate Russian sensitivities, including, as I noted in the piece for you, yesterday, he has terminated American government support for a Yale program that was tracking the tens of thousands of children that Russia has abducted from Ukraine. So it's not as though Trump isn't moving heaven and earth to try and bolster relations by any means necessary with the Kremlin. Now, even so, the Russians are very tough negotiators. We'll see how the call goes today between Trump and Zelensky, who are talking later today. I don't think Trump is ever really going to turn on Russia. I think he has a psychological bond with the country that dates from the 1980s. And his wives have all come from Eastern Europe as well. So he really feels an affinity with Putin, which he mentioned the other day too, when he said that he and Putin had both survived the so-called Russia hoax together. So there is a bond there. Now, this flabbergasts many Europeans. I was just in Amsterdam and I was in Germany for the elections. And I think Europeans are only beginning to comprehend that Trump prefers to work with autocrats rather than with democracies. There was a statement again I think yesterday on Fox, where he talked about how good his relations are with North Korea, China, and Russia, that he likes the leaders of those countries.
Mm. But I mean, he does have a sort of point in thinking that a lot of multilateral institutions are not very good at achieving their objectives. And he has a better shot of doing it than, say NATO. I mean, NATO, for all the support, for all the bluster, yes, they've stopped Russia walking through Ukraine, arguably, but the war is not being won. And NATO deterrence hasn't worked to that extent.
Disagree, because Ukraine was not a member of NATO, and Putin on his own decided to launch a revanchist war, which he thought he could win within a week. And then it turned into his version of the second Iraq War for the United States. It became something of a fiasco. The Biden administration, had it armed Ukraine sufficiently at the outset when the Ukrainians were making big gains, probably could have helped you or ensured a Russian defeat in Ukraine. It didn't happen for reasons of realpolitik, which were that the Biden administration didn't want to run the risk of the collapse of Russia as a sovereign entity, or watch Putin being overthrown and replaced by, who knows, perhaps an even more authoritarian leader. So that didn't happen. I reject your defeatism. I think the Ukrainians have essentially fought the Russians to a standstill. And that and Europe, Germany, France are all mobilizing right now to ensure that Ukraine is not left in the lurch, as well as the Baltic states. I think Ukraine really is pivotal in this instance. That we cannot just walk out of there and allow Putin to seize its resources and manpower. By contrast, I think that the Trump administration is making a mistake in the Middle East, becoming further enmeshed in the conflicts there, as the war in the Gaza Strip spreads, and as we are deploying our military to target the Houthis. That seems to me like a true squandering of American military power.
Well, I don't think I'm defeatist. I think we're probably realist, because I don't see what defeat of Russia would have looked like. Let's say that Ukraine had pushed all Russian forces with massive support from massive and instant support from the West, had pushed all Russian forces out of Ukraine. Do we think Putin would have accepted, or even the people around Putin would have accepted that defeat? Or do we think, no, they would have just gone back and back and back, and they have the manpower, the resources, they are a much bigger country than Ukraine, and they would not have given up? I don't realistically see how Ukraine could have defeated Russia without actual Western military involvement, which was never really on the cards.
I disagree. I think the red line for Putin would have been Crimea, that had Ukrainian forces attempted to liberate Crimea, that then he would have turned to tactical nuclear weapons. But up to that point, no. I mean, let's face it, the Ukrainians actually invaded sovereign Russian territory in Kursk, and Putin did not escalate. He has proven to be quite cautious overall in responding to the West's aid to Ukraine. Another measure that Putin obviously has taken is to foment terrorist activity inside Europe. These plans for putting bombs on planes, targeting EU officials and for assassination and so forth. But he has not actually use tactical nuclear weapons. I think we could have stopped the Russian invasion of the Ukrainian territories.
Mm. Well, I don't think uh, that Putin's reluctance to escalate the conflict is necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I think it's probably quite gratifying that Russia isn't escalating towards nuclear war because it could have done.
Well, the cost would have been immense. I mean, yes, obviously he could and can, but the Chinese have made it abundantly clear that they don't want nuclear missiles being launched willy-nilly. And
Mm.
I don't think Putin wants to take that risk. To that extent, the Cold War rules have held.
Do you think that like a lot of people say that now Xi Jinping will be emboldened to take Taiwan because he can see that the West won't stand up to an aggressive superpower?
Emboldened, yes. Will he actually embark upon an invasion of Taiwan, or will he seek to use a tourniquet? I would think that he would be more likely to try and blockade Taiwan than to want to launch an invasion. The Chinese have not been in a military conflict since their invasion of Vietnam in 1978, which was a debacle. And, we know as early as Thucydides that these sort of expeditions, the Sicilian expedition turned into a disaster for the Athenians. They were wildly overconfident.
Mm.
Uh, Taking Taiwan, assaulting it, uh, is not a no-brainer for the Chinese. They would obviously like to coerce it into submission. And I'm not sure that Trump himself would have huge reservations about China incorporating Taiwan. I think Trump's ambition is to leave the region, to pull American troops from South Korea and to force the Japanese to rearm.
Mm. Well, having spent some time recently in Europe, what do you make of this Macron-Starmer idea? Emmanuel Macron, French president, Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, of a coalition of the willing. I think it's an unfortunate phrase. And I mean, I think it seems to me that Russia's never going to accept a kind of European force with British troops in particular. It would be anti the idea of British troops operating in Europe. And it is potentially a trigger point to a very serious conflict between Europe and Russia. And Donald Trump doesn't seem to be interested in providing the security backstop that Keir Starmer is offering. What do you make of this European plan?
I have come away from several weeks in Europe feeling more bullish about the continent, primarily because incoming German Chancellor Friedrich Merz managed to overcome the debt brake in Germany, which had crippled spending. And he successfully persuaded the German federal parliament yesterday, including the Greens, to back a 500 billion euro package for infrastructure and rebuilding the German army. Meanwhile, Macron is talking about revitalizing an air base near the border with Germany. Uh, I think Putin, and to some degree Trump, may regret having reanimated the Europeans as an independent force because it is increasingly clear to Macron and to Merz and to other European leaders that they're on their own. They can, in fact, no longer rely on the United States. However, that does attenuate the American ability to influence Europe and to use it for power projection into the Middle East, for example. So,
Mm.
and for Putin, the idea that Poland is going to get nuclear weapons, that the nuclear umbrella will be extended to Germany, that perhaps more nuclear weapons will be stationed in Germany. I don't see how any of this redounds to the benefit of Russian national security. Now, as to the Starmer-Macron, I don't know what's actually going to develop as far as a ceasefire. There may not be a ceasefire for another year. I think the Russians eventually will accede to an agreement. But right now, Putin is slowly advancing and thinks that he has the whip hand. So there really is no cogent reason for him to stop fighting. But given the bloodletting, the increased Ukrainian ability to manufacture their own arms, I think that if we have the staying power and continue to support Ukraine, that there will be a ceasefire in say 6 months to a year that will be more agreeable to the Ukrainians and to the Western Europeans. Now, whether there's going to be a couple of thousand European troops as part of that in Ukraine, no, I wouldn't rule it out.
Well, I mean, what you're talking about there is World War III, isn't it not? I mean, that would
No,
mean
it's not
Russia
World War III.
fighting.
It's the
It would
opposite.
mean, why not? Why is it the opposite? I mean, it'd be Russia
Because
fighting.
there's any number of paths you can take here. You could move for some kind of Austrian solution where, as we had in 1955, where Austria is a neutral power. You could have that status for Ukraine.
Yeah, but the
From
Russians would be happy
45
with that.
onwards, we had the four powers in Berlin until really 1989, actually. Berlin, I mean, was divided into four zones. So I don't know. The Russians have lived with this before. I don't know. I think Macron was right. Ukraine is a sovereign country. If they want to have French and British troops on their soil, they're allowed to.
Next, it's Kellie-Jay Keen and Natasha Feroze discussing the NHS and its gender mix-up.
This week, a report has revealed that for the past 10 years, gender has consistently replaced sex when it comes to government data collection. This has caused all kinds of problems, such as cervical cancer screenings, when you are categorising patients in single-sex wards, and even in the prison service. To talk about this, I'm joined by Kellie-Jay Keen, also famously known as Posey Parker. Kelly, thank you so much for joining us on Spectator TV. I think lots of people have been saying that the trans turf war is over, but the report this week kind of suggests otherwise. What do you make of it?
Well, the implications are kind of every aspect of a woman's life, aren't they? When you conflate gender and sex, and I just want to preface this to say I don't believe in gender. I think it's a nonsensical term. It doesn't really mean anything. It means lots of different things to lots of different people, unlike the word sex. And so I find the whole thing very confusing and not helpful, very, very unhelpful. So we should just be recording biological sex. Nothing else is really important. Nothing else is a true indicator of the way humans behave, the sort of trends or the healthcare implications that we have, criminality. All of these things do actually matter based on our sex and actually will inform people based on our sex. But nothing else does, apart from maybe a diagnosis of some sort of condition or another.
And it's quite surprising how pervasive this has become. I mean, people have missed out on cervical cancer screenings, prostate cancer screenings. It's affected single-sex wards in hospitals. Do you think that the NHS, in the way it is now, has been focused on this woke agenda? And in the meantime, we're facing the highest level of cancer wait lists, hip replacements take weeks to be done. Is this just the culture in the NHS?
Yes, in a word, yes, it is the culture in the NHS. I think it's not just the NHS, but every place that kind of puts a focus on this particular issue, like we'll call it trans. Every organisation that focuses on that, I think it's a distraction. And that means that they're not focusing on something else. So sometimes governments might focus on it, and all types of woke, and actually the economy is failing in the NHS. Like you say, there's so many key areas that the NHS is failing. Like to get an appointment with a consultant dermatologist, for example, you're looking at about 6 to 9 months to get just a chat, just an initial consultation. So the fact that the NHS, I looked into it, and I'm going to be conservative and say they spend about £50 million a year just on DEI hires. So this will just be people with diversity and inclusion in their actual job title. So the rest of it just flows from that. But yeah, we waste so much money. It's criminal.
You have to feel sorry for some of the staff working in the NHS and how awkward labelling people must be with pronouns. They've been told not to use Mr. and Mrs. They've been told not to really use the term man or woman. Just a recent case was nurse Sandy Peggy, who complained about a trans person changing in the women's facilities and has had to go through a huge trial. I mean, do you blame the staff?
Do I blame the staff? Yes and no. So Dr. Upton, who is the sort of the focus of the Sandy Peggy case, and I think Sandy Peggy, amazing, fantastic. Thank you very much for actually standing up for yourself. But there will be so many members of staff that have watched that man gaslight patients and pretend that he's female, or forcing others to pretend he's female. Patients who are in vulnerable situations, they might be teenage girls, they might be elderly women, they might just generally be any patient going into that A&E. So I've known for a long time about the danger of staff. We've had numerous stories about men who cross-dress, who are working in the NHS, and the NHS seems to just let them carry on. We know that there was a woman in a psych ward, for example, and it was supposed to be female only. And when she said that man next to me is frightening me, and she was told that's a woman, and on her notes, it was recorded that she was a transphobic bigot. That was like back in 2016, 2017. So this sort of infringement, gaslighting and cognitive dissonance has been going on in the NHS for far too long. And you have to blame the managers who are clearly creating these policies just to kind of have something to do, I think, and to exert some sort of power. But every single member of staff that sat in one of those training sessions and said nothing and gone along with it and then inflicted that on a patient, including a patient recently who was having an internal examination. She asked for a chaperone, and the two people in that room with her was a male doctor and a male nurse who called himself a woman. So she was actually put in the position where she was in a room with two men when she'd asked for a female chaperone. So it's not just a little bit wrong. It is sexual assault. It is, quite frankly, disgusting.
This has actually been going on for 10 years, that according to the report. And just looking at the history of the NHS, there's never really been a policy on how to deal with the issue of people who want to be a different gender.
Well, it's that word gender again. Like I don't even know what that means in this context. Like, what does a different gender mean? Because I just don't think we have genders.
But you have if someone did have gender dysphoria, surely they would have to be classified on medical records.
Well, I don't even think gender dysphoria is really a very helpful term either. I think you have fully grown men claiming that they have something called gender dysphoria when we know that actually their motivations are something quite different. And then you have girls as a response to trauma who might decide that they would rather not be girls anymore. And sometimes that's because they're autistic or because they don't fit in with their peers, or there's been some sort of sexual abuse. But I just don't think gender dysphoria is helpful either. What do we do with somebody who goes into hospital and expects a duty of care and compassion from the nurses and the clinicians that they come into contact with? Well, I don't think that a man who pretends to be a woman should feel any less included or any less well looked after if he's on a men's ward. And there are mixed wards, and there are female-only wards, and there are male-only wards, and then there are single occupancy rooms. So there's plenty of spaces already for people. Like there will be people that aren't appropriate to share with other people. You know, there will be people that go into hospital that are pretty terrible people who aren't fit to share a ward with other people. I'm sure we make accommodations for them.
It has been interesting looking at the NHS website, because it says there's been a recent development in which there's an introduction of 2 questions now. So it's, what is your gender identity, and does your gender identity match your sex assigned at birth? If you were running the NHS, Kelly, would you just remove that then? And
whenever any woman in this country goes under anaesthetic, she is entitled, or by law, I think, but certainly in practice, there is always a woman in that theatre with her. And I learnt this because I recently had some surgery, and I asked if there would be a woman, and they were like, yes, well, as a woman going under anaesthesia, you have a woman often in the room, always in the room. And I think we can all gather that that's because women are at risk of sexual assault by men, even when those men are doctors and surgeons that we see in the NHS when we're in our most vulnerable positions. So this idea that anything else matters is frankly just insane.
yes, and the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, said about this report, the Sullivan Review underlines the importance of recording biological sex, not just for research and insight, but also patient safety. Doing so does not prevent us from recording, recognising and respecting people's gender identity where these differ. We'll act on the findings. So you wouldn't be in Labour's camp when it comes to their policy on gender, sorry, I said the word again, ideology.
It's all right, you carry on. I wouldn't be in anyone's camp who like to validate fictitious identities, no. I think we're in this situation now where I cannot guarantee when my daughter goes out into a public space where there is an assumption that there is a female-only space, I can't guarantee to my daughter that there won't be men in there. And furthermore, I can't guarantee that the man in there, when she complains about him being in there, will be removed, because he will actually have more of a right to that space than my daughter. So it's a thin end of the wedge. I've been talking about this since 2016, and it's the same argument. If you allow any of these things to have any importance in public policy, whether it's the NHS, the police, like anywhere where my tax money is funding that particular service, if you, which means you can't opt out, right? Most people can't opt out of the NHS. They can't afford to go elsewhere, and elsewhere is equally as bad. So these places that you don't have a choice, I think the government has an absolute duty to take this ideological nonsense out of it completely.
And it seems so shocking, doesn't it, that the issue of trans rapists going into women's prisons still exists after the Sturgeon row, where the rapist Isla Bryson was moved from a women's prison to a man's prison.
So I'm just going to pick you up on all of the confusion when we use the language of your question. So, and I mean this in the most
Go for it.
pleasant way possible. So when you use trans prisoner, right, I don't hear man. Like, people listening don't hear man. People in the prison service don't hear man. Everybody sort of thinks that there's this category of, you know, nearly a woman or a subset of woman or a subset of something, but they don't hear man, which is why some of these men are in women's prisons. So that's why language is really, really important, because once you start capitulating on any of it, once you say trans woman, once you say trans, any of these things, you really do lose sight of the genuine facts of there is a man who's raped a woman who is now in a women's prison. If you say it like that, it's far more jarring and makes far less sense than if you say there is a trans rapist. So that's why I've really stuck to language for these last sort of this nearly a decade, because it's in those kind of opaque sentences and and meaning that we lose sight of what really we're talking about.
I hear you, Kelly, but the rates of people with gender dysphoria is not going to start dropping anytime soon, one would suggest, just by looking at how much it's been growing now. And so just being pragmatic, what are people supposed to do if someone says to you, I don't identify as a man or woman? Do we just ignore that?
Yes, we do just ignore that. Yes. Just like if I said, I'm a black woman, or I'm Chinese. Like, we would ignore that we would think that was insulting, offensive, and quite ridiculous. So yes, we do. Yes, we do just ignore it because it's not true. In addition, the premise of the question is that gender dysphoria exists, and that gender dysphoria is the motivating factor. Like, let's say it exists. I don't really think it does. I think it's a name for something where someone is disassociating, and often it's a name for someone who has a fetish. And I think most grown men who claim to be women are driven by fetish. And I'd probably say all, but I'll just hedge my bets and say most. And that's not the same thing for women and girls. And maybe grown women are driven by some sort of narcissism, but also girls can be, it can be a response to trauma, as I said before. But the rates of the fact that something is growing means it's less likely to be true, because if it's a true thing, where were these people 10, 20, 30 years ago? Well, they didn't really exist, and they certainly weren't growing exponentially. So I think Trump has the best idea, which is just cut it all out of government. No more federal funding in the United States for any of this nonsense, and I think we do well to do the same over here.
A few years ago, I think it was last year actually, we had you on with Richard Tice, who at the time was the leader of Reform. And we thought perhaps you could have a political alignment with the Reform Party. Maybe they would agree with you on the trans policy, gender policy. I don't know what you want to call it. Is there any party that you align yourself with, or are you still going at it alone?
Well, I did form Party of Women to answer that particular question, so we could have the conversation. I mean, as much as I think I am the next Margaret Thatcher, I don't think I'm going to be controlling the country anytime soon. But I think they make all the right noises at Reform. But I just wonder, really, I don't know if many men truly get it. I mean, I hope they do, and they'd be well advised to take counsel from me at any point that they so desire. But when it comes to any of these parties, they don't really get it. But maybe Reform is closest, but Party of Women is created to deal with that question. We come out of the European Court of Human Rights. I'd like to scrap the Equality Act, and I'd like to scrap the Gender Recognition Act. I think those three things are the foundation upon which all this pack of lies has been created. This terrible structure of fiction.
Well, what about Kemi Badenoch? I mean, they all sound like you both align.
No, we don't. I think Kemi she's heading in the right direction, but she's a politician first and foremost, and I'm an activist, and so I'm not limited by having to appease people, which is something that I'm very, very proud of. I'm not in the business of appeasing anyone. I just want women and children to have their rights and their safeguarding not eroded. So when it comes to Kemi, I think she sort of talked about, I'm very pleased to support trans rights. And I'm just thinking, well, that's a bit of a platitude. And what are trans rights?
Is Keir Starmer actually a Tory? Cindy Yu discusses now with columnist Rod Liddle and former Labour MP turned independent Rosie Duffield.
Slashing winter fuel allowance, keeping the two-child benefits cap, cutting foreign aid, cutting the civil service, axing NHS bureaucracy and slashing welfare spending. Rod, are we actually living under a Conservative government?
No, because the Conservative government didn't do any of that because it didn't have the appetite for it or the bravery. I've actually, in the last month, considered rejoining the Labour Party. It's a blue Labour Party. It reflects pretty much everything I ever wanted from the Labour Party. There are a few problems. I think Rachel Reeves is a problem. But other than that, I think it is doing things which will make it appeal to working class voters far more than it did in the first 100 days of its existence. And I don't for a moment blame Rosie at all, who I think is a terrific MP and a great figure in the House of Commons. I don't blame Rosie for having resigned the whip when she did, because I think the first kind of 150 days of Labour were catastrophic. And you were right about the winter fuel allowance. That was completely wrong of the Labour government to do that. But suddenly a kind of realism afflicted the party, the government, pretty much as soon as Donald Trump had been elected as president. And I think that's the change that's happened. And I think what it can do now is carry on appealing to working class voters. It's still remarkably, despite its enormous unpopularity in those first 150 days, ahead in the polls. The Tories nowhere to be seen. And reform, as I've always said, will never get much more than 25% ever, no matter what they do. So no, I think Labour has performed incredibly well since about the middle of December, early January. I think Sir Keir Starmer's, much though I'm not his greatest fan, I have to say, and I know Rosie isn't, I think he's performed reasonably well with Trump. But I think also he's getting advice from good places. You know, Morgan McSweeney, not least among them, or Boaty McBoatface, as I call him.
Well, Rosie, you left the Labour Party about half a year ago. I assume you've never felt so far from the Labour Party as it is today.
Yeah, absolutely that. And it's so interesting hearing what Rod's saying, because, you know, we're in this bubble, and to hear a completely different point of view is really fascinating, because I have almost other way round view of it. I don't think voters take kindly to a party pretending to be something that they're not. And they seem to be trying to ape the Tories and ape reform, but actually that's not what people want when they vote Labour. They've got two other parties to vote for if they want those things. And I think that we proved that in 2017 for all of the things that were wrong. And Jeremy Corbyn was, you know, at the height of his sort of powers, and especially amongst young people, for all the things we then got wrong. At that time, we got the Tory government's majority down to 12. I felt on the doorstep that it was because we had a very red offer. The Tories had a very blue offer. People had a really clear choice, unlike in 2015 when Ed and all the other men in suits all looked pretty much the same. I thought in 2017 we really had a very good identity about what we were as a party and our history and our values. I don't think we've got that at all now with the Labour Party and the Labour government. And it's all very well saying, yes, they're doing some okay things, Rod happens to like. But that's not a direction, that's not an ideology. It's not even good politics. It's messy, it's muddled. Who are you appealing to? Who are your MPs? What party did they join? Where are your members? It's all a complete mess. And Labour veteran MPs like me are just watching in absolute horror and disbelief.
Well, Rosie, what do you say to Rod's point that it is actually a blue Labour approach?
I think it is trying to be that, but you can't be that when you've got such a large movement and you've got MPs who've sat under a very left-wing regime and now this seeming right-wing or not even political regime. I think it's just kind of accidental if they've landed where Rod is politically and that he thinks he's looking at a more blue Labour Party. I think that's accidental. My entire sort of political experience of this leadership is that they're not political and they don't really know what they're doing. I think it's just, it's happenstance, you know, Trump coming in and all of those things. I think they've just accidentally been in the right place at the right time, and that's not going to last long.
That's interesting. I think Rosie's largely right about Keir Starmer not being political. I think that's absolutely right. I don't think it's a coincidence, however, that, you know, the one Labour figure who was invited to Trump's inauguration was Maurice Glassman, and that Morgan McSweeney and John Cruddas, who's put in a few words in here and there, are both from that blue Labour background. Where I do agree with Rosie, which is there's two sides to blue Labour. One of them is, and I think this does appeal to working class people, that they don't like they don't like the notion that they're working hard and doing the right thing while other people are taking the piss a little bit. They really, really don't like that. And that's why I think, for example, the benefits stuff will play well. However, where I think Rosie's right is it's all very well to do that, but you've got to show some economic radicalism as well. And you know, the stuff which has been talked about, the nationalisation of the railways, the nationalisation of the utilities companies, and I would go for tax breaks for the very, very lowest paid, and also do more to excuse me, to support young couples with children, more tax breaks there as well. So I think if you are going to go down the Blue Labour path, you have to go down it the whole way rather than just the stuff which annoys the far left. And I don't think, in a way, you know, Blue Labour is probably in a sense closer to Corbyn. It's certainly closer to Corbyn than it was to Blair. We don't really have much time for the Blairites, but I do take on board some of what Rosie says there. I would just say, you know, keep pressing for those radical economic measures, which you know are important and we all know are important, as well as the stuff which plays to the gallery of ghastly old fascists like me.
Rosie?
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I just, if either of you were smack bang in the heart of Westminster at the moment, you'd know that it just feels that Labour is this directionless kind of ragtag kind of cobbled together party at the moment. And it feels like on the one hand, you've got Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell still in the party, still sort of independent, but still, you know, in John's case, sitting on the Labour benches along with Richard Bergen and everyone. And we've got, you know, all of us who are probably soft left or more on the left are actually winning by quite big majorities. We're quite popular. And then you've got these brand new MPs who are, I wouldn't even call them Blue Labour or sort of centrist. I don't think a lot of them have a political footprint or were particularly political or active. And they've got majorities of kind of honestly less than 100 or something. And you just think they haven't had enough time to carve out an identity, to kind of speak passionately on these issues. And all of a sudden that we're being, Labour are being called the nasty party, and that's not great. And I mean, I have to be honest, a lot of the veteran Labour MPs just absolutely know that those new MPs are, a lot of them, gone already, because their political message just isn't there. You know, there's no coherence at all.
It was always, in a sense, a shallow victory. I mean, it was a broad victory, but a shallow victory.
Yeah.
And I think some of them will go. I just pray that Luke Meyer remains as MP for Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland. He's an absolutely brilliant bloke.
Oh, good.
And you know, a proper. I take what you say. I don't think they're particularly ideological. I get that. But you know, you talk to someone like Luke, who's been a councillor for 10 years and works in his local community. There is a genuine old Labour sensibility about him, which I find rather commendable. And you know, I also think that if I were to do a cabinet reshuffle, I would replace. Goodness me. How can I forget the name of the Chancellor of the Exchequer?
Rachel.
You've already
Reeves.
attacked her earlier, Rod.
I would replace Rachel Reeves with John McDonnell tomorrow at the drop of a hat.
Oh, radical. I'd love that.
You see, well, this is the thing. This is the thing. When I was out on the doorstep during those two elections which you mentioned, there was no objection amongst the working class voters up here in the north, particularly, to anything that John McDonnell was saying. None at all. There was an objection to all the other crap which came along with Jeremy and John, including, of course, the transgender stuff, which you know all about. So it's a kind of socially conservative constituency, but it's economically radical. And I think Labour needs to do a little more of that, sure.
I think that's really interesting. You've hit the nail on the head in so many ways. And I think that can be summed up by the fact that people talk about the Westminster bubble, but this lot, Keir and his team are basically leading a party of barristers, not baristas, and it feels as though they're all from their own bubble. And I look at some of the things that Keir says and the fact he can't answer questions on the hoof and think, does he ever speak to ordinary people? And I felt like that about him as leader of the opposition. I'm not sure he's got any connection outside of sort of Camden and his barrister friends to the working class seats in the north, because the socially conservative, economically kind of, it's complex, it's complicated.
It's complex.
And I don't think we're anywhere near it with this government. I genuinely believe, I'd love to be as optimistic as you and think it was deliberate. I genuinely believe it's accidental that he's had a little bit of a bounce, and that's all to do with anyone in that position who'd had the Ukraine and Trump sort of stuff would have had that bounce. And I think domestic policy is what people vote on, and it really isn't going well.
You're right. All the stuff which Starmer has done with a reasonable degree of deftness, which is the foreign affairs stuff, doesn't really play at home. It is the domestic stuff which is important. But there have been other signs, Rosie, that the Labour Party's kind of changed and moving down the sort of track I was talking about. Even Lisa Nandy, who in that Rosie Jenny Lee Memorial Lecture, inaugural lecture, telling the lefties, look, don't boycott arts festivals and campaign when BP is sponsoring it. Get a bit of reality into your lives. And I thought that was indicative and good and everything. So I do agree with you. I agree with you principally about Sir Keir Starmer. I've written about him this week in the magazine and described his tetchiness. He seems. I actually said that he looked constipated, as if he'd eaten nothing but rotten cheese for a month.
Excellent.
Was my line. And I don't think he has a touch, and he's not popular. And you can see Wes Streeting hopping around in the background. So
I think it's a matter of when, not if. Actually,
it's a matter of when, not if. Yes.
Yeah.
But Rod, how much do you buy into what's happened lately? Because it was only a few years ago when Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner were taking the knee, during Black Lives Matter.
Exactly that. You've hit the nail on the head. I mean, you cannot suddenly change everything you've been saying, in some cases for 10 or 15 years, and expect the public to go, oh, yeah, as if they've been living in a sort of coma for the last 10, 15 years. That's just not possible. So it plays into that old trope that you can't trust politicians, they're all liars, and that everyone's the same. And frankly, I'd struggle to deny that to my constituents now, because it feels that everything we've all been active against or for in the last decade or so is completely meaningless. For example, WASPI. I stood with the WASPI women in 2015 when the campaign started. I've always supported them and just been waiting for Labour to officially support them, because every MP I know has been supportive of the WASPI women, and we've all been outside on College Green and Parliament Square, campaigning with them. And now people are pretending they didn't say that, or just being silent and doing nothing at all now in government. So if I was a voter without any sort of political, insiderness, I would be just as sceptical. And it's terrible politics. You either say, look, I've changed my mind, or I don't know, they're not even saying that, are they? They're just pretending they didn't say those things.
Well, that's
awful.
That's sheer Keir, isn't it?
Absolutely.
You're right, all the way through.
Can't stand it.
No, and I get that entirely. I do think they've grasped, though, and it's interesting you bring up the Rayner Starmer knee photo, which is still. I've got it pinned on my wall. I think
is it your dartboard, Rod?
I just look at it and think, you mug. And I think they've realised that woke is gone. It's a horrible word, woke, and it'll be good when we don't have to use it anymore. But I think all that stuff. I know you're still battling on that transition.
They're still briefing against me, Rod, every now and again. They've got nothing left. But, I'm not convinced woke is gone in the Labour Party, because the people that were sort of actively campaigning against me are all now in number 10, you see. So
Yeah,
it's
well,
hard for me to believe they've
okay,
let that go.
I'm not in Westminster, thank the Lord, having lost by a mere 16,000 votes in July
Valiant effort.
to a very good bloke. Have you met him yet, by the way?
No, I don't think I have. I don't really know the new ones yet, but
No, it must be difficult. But no, I take exactly what you say. I think if it's not dead, it's dying. And I think Rosie, you've won the trans argument. I think that is pretty much won. And there are other more difficult issues to follow, but it never appealed to the general public.
no.
Ever, any of it. And I think they've grasped that it's of a harm to them electorally. But I do agree with your main point about Sir Keir Starmer, which is that, going into the election, he renounced virtually everything he'd promised in the previous 3 years. It was remarkable.
I mean, the election, taking over the Labour Party as well, he was no longer that kind of right-hand man to Jeremy Corbyn figure that he used to be. I mean, but none of this can be a comfort to you, Rosie, that woke is dead or that the party's moved on, because you're no longer in the party and you did have, terrible times when you were in there. And now to say that they've moved on without, kind of any closure with you.
I mean, that was inevitable. When this particular sort of branch of woke died, it was inevitable that they'd all pretend that they were there. They were, there with me in the fight from the beginning. But, most of us involved really heavily in that who were cancelled or soft cancelled know that that's not true. And I haven't had approaches from any of those people to convince me that they've changed their minds. So I know that's not true. And some of them have grasped that it's not politically expedient to kind of bang on about all of that stuff anymore, but not all of them. And I mean, they'll never embrace me again while Keir's leader, because I've embarrassed him and I've kind of criticised him. But if the party is moving along, and incidentally, no Labour veteran MPs, i.e. before this election, ever imagined that Keir would be Prime Minister throughout and for 5 years, or the leader for all that time. And we didn't before the election. I mean, that was never a thing. And I think most of us still don't. So we'll see what happens.
I have to say that in the manifestos at the last election, the SDP's economic manifesto was way to the left of the Labour.
Oh, absolutely.
Way to the left of the Labour Party. So I have this suggestion, Rosie, because our leader is away with his family in South Korea at the moment. If you were to join the SDP, you could become leader within a few days, and you would have this party of adoring people behind you.
Gosh, thank you.
Yeah, no, pleasure. Or I could go the other way. I'll rejoin Labour, and you come and take over the SDP.
Rosie, why do you think the Labour Party is cutting Keir Starmer so much slack with this rightward turn? I mean, I can imagine there'll be so many people who are pretty gored by what's happening at the moment.
I think, if I'm completely honest about the way that Westminster works, the system of getting rid of someone is quite difficult, but also he's sort of suppressed everyone. I mean, I've never known a regime where if you even raise a thought or an idea that might criticise or be seen to be critical, or even suggest we might go in a different direction, you're slapped down immediately, you're disciplined, and the weapon of choice is to brief against any MP raising anything. So this huge comms team that are paid vast amounts of money, they seem to be very good at this kind of just slapping people down, briefing against them, threatening them. That's the way that they've behaved, certainly towards the end of Starmer being Lotto, leader of the opposition, and now very much that's the sort of status quo. If anyone raises an objection or asks a question, of course, if you're new, you're frightened to do that. You don't really know your way around yet, and it's very Orwellian. I've never known it to be like that. You can't raise an idea, and it's partly because, in my opinion and my feeling, that those in charge at the very top don't have very many political ideas. They don't really want to hear them. They're not really interested in that aspect of power.
I think you might be seeing them now. I think that Starmer's ear has been caught by a few people who are seriously intelligent and ideologically based politicians. But we'll have to see. I mean, I think the other side to what Rosie was saying is, I don't think there's an appetite within the general public, given the debacle of the Conservative government foisting different prime ministers. People don't want change particularly. They want a bit of stability. And if that's Sir Keir Starmer, well, so be it. I think you're probably right that he won't last for 5 years. He doesn't look as if he wants to last.
No. He looks as though he's got his eye on a sort of David Miliband, international, global, Tony Blair Institute type of role, I think, in the future.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think that's right.
And Rod, just finally, just as we right-wing commentators have been kind of caught out by this turn and just kind of grudgingly admiring it, where do you think this leaves the Conservative Party now in terms of what opposition are they meant to be putting when, as you say, they didn't do any of the stuff when they were in government either?
Exactly where it is now, which is invisible to everybody. And you say, I mean, it's the opening paragraph of my piece, which is I do think the right has been seriously discombobulated by what's happened, and so has Reform, and so, of course, has the Labour left. So this is a really pivotal moment internationally for the world, for the UK, for relations with America, for relations with Europe, and I think that at the moment, I mean, if one is going to be boring about it, that actually what happens on the foreign stage is briefly rather more important than what happens at home. And I think some people do gather that. I just can't, I will listen to Rosie because she knows about Sir Keir Starmer and has had problems with him before. And she's a great constituency MP and would be a brilliant figure in any government. But the right wingers who simply loathe Labour because it's Labour, and won't even say, well, actually, that's rather a good thing. Why didn't the Tories do that? So, for example, when NHS England is abolished, you expected the Tories to come out and say, why are you doing this? This is crucial to the running of the health service. And they came out one after the other and said, oh, yeah, not bad idea. It's a very strange political time indeed.
Isn't it?
That's all for us this week. Don't forget to hit the bell button so you never miss another episode. Join us again this time next week.